Hello and welcome to our podcast through the University of Kansas Medical Center. My name is Angela Carrasco, and joining us today we have Dr. Nancy Brady, professor and chairperson of the Department of Speech, Language, Hearing Sciences and Disorders at the University of Kansas. Dr. Brady also serves as the co-director for the Intercampus Program in Communicative Disorders. Thank you for joining us today, Nancy.
I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for asking me, Angela.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I have been a speech pathologist for a long time before I went into academia. So I got my master's at the University of Minnesota. My undergraduate was at UC Santa Barbara, which unfortunately that program no longer exists. But that cuts down my number of alumni associations to just two. And then I got my Ph.D. at the University of Kansas. Then I went and was on faculty back at University of Minnesota. And then due to some family issues, we came back to Kansas, and I first worked as a research professor for a number of years, and then a faculty line opened up, and I've been very happy to be in the Department of Speech, Language, Hearing for about 12 years now.
Well, we are definitely happy to have you here.
Great.
You are the co-director of the Fragile X Research Lab. Could you explain what type of research you do in your lab?
Yes, it's a very exciting study that Steve Warren and I have been conducting for a number of years. It's a longitudinal family study. So we have families that have a child with Fragile X syndrome, and Fragile X syndrome is a relatively rare disorder. About 1 in 4,000 males have the disorder, and then less females. But it is linked to the X chromosome, so males are more affected. And individuals who have this disorder have usually some form of intellectual disability, and it's very variable. So they may have just very mild disorders, especially girls, or they could be very severe and not talk and have severe behavioral problems. So it's quite a range of abilities. But our study is, again, longitudinal, so we've been following the kids since they were about 3 years old.
Wow.
And now they're in high school.
Oh.
So we've really gotten to know these families, and they're because it's a fairly rare disorder, they're all over the country. So our dedicated staff fly all over the country to collect the data. So that's pretty exciting too. And so everywhere from Massachusetts to they just got back from Steamboat Springs, Colorado. So anyway, they go and collect the data remotely and then bring it back, and we analyze it. So we're really interested in parent-child interactions and how that affects the development of the child, and also how the mother is progressing in the family too, which sounds a little bit different, but because it is an X-linked disorder, there are some traits that some moms also show. So some of the moms maybe have some effects both physically and have some minor or some degree of intellectual impairment too.
So it could be definitely genetically passed down, is what it sounds like.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you can do for mothers now to do some type of test to know if that is something that they carry already?
Yes, it is recommended that moms get tested. That's much easier because it's so rare. It's been hard to get testing passed or legislation passed to recommend testing for the kids. But some states are now starting to do mandatory testing for the moms to kind of try to detect whether they're a carrier. And then if they're a carrier, they obviously would meet with a genetics counselor to see if they're likely to have a child that has the effect.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. We're trying to learn ways that the mom's interactions can benefit the child too. So we already know that some of the ways that they interact with their kids are facilitated for their language development. That's my main area, but then other areas of the child's development too. So it's been very interesting, and we're hoping that we get to continue to follow them on into adulthood. It's just such a rich sample of information about these families.
Do you have a hard time keeping the same individuals involved in the study?
We do. We do all kinds of strategies. We send birthday cards. We, call. We follow them on Facebook, or we ask them to follow us on Facebook. many, many different strategies. Going to them helps too. And then again, we'll try to see them on weekends. So our research assistants are really exceptional. And our director of the Fragile X Lab, Shelley Braden-Auger, is just masterful at keeping these relationships going. And really, it's been remarkable to keep as many families. I think we've only lost 5 or 6 families over the years that we've been following them. So
she is pretty amazing.
She is very amazing.
Are you still recruiting new subjects as well?
Not exactly, but we did add a couple of families from the area who now have a child who is an adolescent. We added those too. So if there was somebody local that we could add, we would do that. But since it's a longitudinal sample, we can't really go back and get their data from when they were little.
True. Well, thank you. I also know you do research with individuals with severe disabilities. What have you found about treating severe disabilities?
So this is really one of my main passions and one thing that I have been focused on pretty much my whole career. And I think that that's kind of the area that I'm known for most in terms of research is assessing and treating individuals that do have severe disabilities. So they may have things like cerebral palsy or not so much Down syndrome, because most folks with Down syndrome do well in terms of their outcomes relatively, but they may have Rett syndrome, Angelman syndrome, or not any identified cause, but just have very severe and limited communication. So I'm really interested in what happens before they start to talk. So all of the research that's described as pre-linguistic communication. So it's really interesting. So much of what we know and think about in terms of communication starts with when kids start to talk. But you have a young child.
Yes.
I have a new grandchild. I have kids. All kinds of things happen communication-wise before they start to talk.
Can you give some examples? I know, for example, sign language. That's something we did with my son, and it felt like that really helped with communication. But what other ways do you see them communicating?
Well, even before they start to sign, there are ways that they're already communicating with you and things that you picked up on probably naturally that you didn't even think of. But when they point, when they reach up for you to grab or to pick them up, even when they're looking back and forth between you and the toy that they want, and you know that means that they want that toy, they just can't reach it, or they might reach towards something and look up at you and vocalize, So all that communication is very powerful for the child. So a lot of my research has focused on identifying how individuals communicate with those skills like we just talked about, and then helping to foster that and teaching them to use that more often, giving value to that pre-linguistic communication. So even if somebody never learns to be a good signer or never learns to use a device, an augmentative communication device, well, or doesn't learn to speak, they can still communicate powerfully with non-symbolic communication too. So that's kind of one of the main things that I focused. Of course, we want people to communicate with symbolic communication because they can communicate with so many more people.
Right.
And communicate about things that are not immediately present. And, talk about stuff that's outside of the immediate surroundings. But it's still very important to be able to communicate with whatever means are available. And then, again, you as a mom, when your child would do those early signals, you would react to them and respond to them and label the things that they're looking at and reaching towards. And all of that input is really, really important, too, for their vocabulary growth. A lot of what I've been doing is both assessing those skills and then teaching them to progress in their pre-linguistic skills, too, in addition to their symbolic forms of communication.
So when you're treating these individuals with severe disabilities, do you particularly work with an age range?
Not necessarily. We just finished one study that went from age 3 to 60 in years.
Wow.
So, yeah, some very interesting things that we found differentially across different age groups. As you can imagine, older individuals that are still functioning at this level have a lot more going on, a lot more impairments, and unfortunately a lot less treatment. So things have just kind of stopped and for a number of reasons. So not as good of chances of additional growth as individuals get older. But we have looked at people that are considered assessed and treated individuals at all different ages. So really it's the developmental level that's the most important thing for my research and in practice. And developmentally it would be kind of prior to 18 months is really what I focused on.
Okay. How did you become interested in this topic?
I think that I became interested in it largely because I sort of grew up with this. I have like so many people in our field, I have a personal story. So I have a brother who has autism, and he has pretty severe autism, and he actually learned to communicate with sign language. Mm-hmm. So he's 4 or 5 years younger than me. So we lived in California, and so I remember riding with my mom to take him to speech at Stanford University, and we would sit there while they worked with him and trained him. And he was actually one of the first children with autism that they taught sign language to. So he was written up in textbooks and has little pictures. And his name is actually Tom, but they always called him Ted. So we used to always kid and say, "Oh, Ted."
I bet he loved that.
Yeah. So he, anyway, so I grew up with him, and obviously caring and wanting to help individuals that are struggling to communicate better. And then became even more interested in it during my schooling. So I think like a lot of undergrads, I kind of thought I wanted to do different things. And then once I took my first speech class, it just clicked. And I really have never looked back.
It was something you were familiar with, you were good at it, and you knew that was something for you.
Yeah, it just resonated, and I really enjoyed almost every speech class. Maybe there was a speech science class I could have left behind, but
Everyone has one of those in their undergrad degree.
Yeah.
Could you explain what the communication complexity scale is and how speech-language pathologists would use this?
Yes. So the area of research that I've been working on the most in the last 10 years is developing this scale called the communication complexity scale. And it documents how somebody communicates before they start to talk. So we were just talking about all those different pre-linguistic ways that typical kids and kids with severe disabilities communicate, and it turns out that there is a developmental sequence. So just like once kids start to talk, they start to talk with one word, and then they add 2 words, and then they start to say sentences. Well, pre-linguistically, there's a very similar developmental order. So we have painstakingly gone through and divided up the scale, or this pre-linguistic period, and created 12 different points along the development, and that's what the scale itself is. And we also have developed some assessment contexts where individuals are encouraged to communicate with whatever means they have. So we have different fun scenarios. So like we might have some bubbles with a lid that's stuck, and we want the individual to request help, hopefully by giving it to us. So we create ways that they can communicate non-verbally and be successful. And so we go through these different scenarios, and then we document how they do communicate, and we assign one of these numbers on our 12-point scale to each one of these behaviors. And then afterwards, we summarize those scores. So we received money from the National Institutes of Health to create this scale because there are not very many assessments currently available. So for research purposes, we need to be able to document when somebody is showing progress. So let's say you have somebody with severe disabilities and you try a new medication or a new behavioral intervention, and you think it might be helping them, but how are you going to know? So most assessments just start with words. So if they're making progress, but they're still not talking, there was really no way to show it. So that's the niche that we're trying to fill with the communication complexity scale. And then obviously, similarly, for clinical purposes, if you're working with a child and you want to say, I've been trying to get them to communicate more, to interact more, maybe interact with their peers, etc., how are you going to show progress in that when most standard assessments, they're still going to be at the very lowest levels?
Right.
So,
and you had mentioned earlier that this 18-month mark seems to be an important one. Up to the 18th month mark, you are showing this nonverbal communication and such. So how do caregivers know when it's time for them to get help for their little ones, if they're not even communicating verbally, how would someone like me just recognize, oh, I should bring my child in to get assessed?
That is an excellent point. I'm so glad you brought that up because I didn't even bring up the predictive power. So that is another area that I think that the communication complexity scale can help with. So again, we've built these milestones based on typical development and developmental theories. So if you had a 12-month-old and they were not showing the skills we would expect to see, like pointing to comment, sharing affect, being positive with their communicative partners, then we would be really worried that something was amiss. Probably more so than if they weren't saying a first word. So all of us are sort of geared up to watch for kids starting to talk,
Right.
I mean, I mentioned I have this granddaughter now, and so we're all doing it. We're all going around, I think she said mama. I think she said nana for grandma. But of course I'm watching. It's like, did she point? Did she just look over there?
Right.
And all of these little more subtle signs that can be an early benchmark. So you don't have to just wait until the child is 2 years old and not talking before you say, okay, we know something's wrong. And you could identify a delay much earlier by looking at these earlier milestones.
Wonderful. So you mentioned 2 or 3 different areas you're doing research. Where do you see your research going in the future?
So this communication complexity scale has been developed again with research dollars, and we've got a very nice protocol. We've got some web-based training materials developed. I think we need to figure out a way to disseminate it more widely. So I've talked to some publishers, so that's one way possibly to go with this tool. But I'm also very interested of late in what's referred to as implementation science. So in trying to create these training modules, there are all kinds of interesting variables that I hadn't considered. So some people learn better over the web, some people learn better face-to-face, and what are those characteristics? And how do you create optimal training platforms so that individuals can learn this in a reasonable period of time? Because one thing we know is that clinicians and researchers are really busy. So they're not going to have as much time available to learn this tool as we've been able to devote to our graduate research assistants in the lab. So there needs to be some sort of, to use a biological term, some more bench to bedside type of transition to get this to be usable. So that's what I'd really like to work on. It's not as maybe theoretically interesting as some of the past research, but at the end of the day, I don't want to work so hard on developing something that just sits on a shelf.
It sounds applicable.
Yeah, it's very applicable, so we really need to figure out how to get it more out there. And so that's what I would really like to work on. And then also in terms of interventions. So we've been working with a particular intervention with children with autism to try to get them into more symbolic communication. We're still learning quite a bit on that project. It is a clinical trials. So I've learned a lot about clinical trials. Boy, that is quite daunting. And
a lot of paperwork, probably.
Lots of paperwork. So registering with clinicaltrials.gov has been quite a learning process, but very worthwhile, I think. So I want to continue that. It's kind of the same areas, kind of pushing on and trying to get things out into people's hands more and developing better interventions. Because I don't know if you know this, but the incidence of autism continues to just rise. So
Yes.
It's just incredible. It used to be like 1 in 116, 1 in 39. And it's a real thing there. For example, even in our research, it's unfortunate for the kids, but it's actually very easy to find kids for our research studies now. It used to be that, there would be 1 or 2 per school district that met our criteria. And now there are whole classrooms of them in every school district. So there are a lot of kids that need this help. So I really want to continue to figure out better interventions and assessments.
Well, you had mentioned that you have students working in the lab with you. About how many students do you have, and are they master's students or PhD students?
Some of each, and some undergrads too. So I really like to have kind of a whole group in a mixture of different levels in the lab. So I got one PhD student who's hopefully going to finish in May, right, Kristen? And then another student who's just completed comps, and then I have a couple kind of new MA, Ph.D. students that are working in the lab. We also often have students from outside of SPLH, outside of speech language hearing also, sometimes in developmental psych. One of my directors, Chris Matthews, is a social worker, which is a great skill to have for directing a research lab. I hadn't thought about it ahead of time, but she's been with me quite a while, so I really appreciate all her skills. And then we do have undergraduate research students, too, that are completing their requirements for their undergraduate research honors projects. And so it's really nice to see everybody learn from each other.
Great experience for the students.
And they really enjoy the mentoring. So the master's and PhD students like mentoring the newer students and sharing all of their skills, and it makes for a lively lab and sometimes some fun parties.
Great. Let me liven it up a little bit now that you've talked about fun parties. Do you have any favorite podcasts or blogs or YouTube channels or anything to which you subscribe?
I do, although it kind of gets away from the party theme because when I listen to podcasts, I tend to kind of nerd out a little bit. So I think my favorite podcast is Hidden Brain. So Shankar Vedantan does this Hidden Brain psychology research, and it's just fascinating. And I learn something every time. I always bring stuff into class, and it's very enjoyable. So his is probably my favorite podcast. I also recently listened to a podcast series called Believed that was about the Michigan State and the gymnastics scandal, Larry Nassar. And very sad, but really an excellent podcast. It was, true crime, and unfortunately it was true. But the way podcasts can, really suck you in and develop the story is really amazing. So I've enjoyed those. And sometimes it can be a hindrance to have such a short commute because it only takes about 10 minutes to get to work. So I'm always like, no.
Right. I have to wait till later to finish the end of the story.
I know.
Well, you and your family seem to be big travelers. Could you tell us a little bit about one or two of your favorite trips?
Sure. My husband likes to do more driving vacations, so we ended up going places like Michigan or, we like to fly to San Francisco and New York City, too. I know a few years ago, I turned 50, and we went to New York City for the very first time for my 50th birthday, and that was a blast. So
I lived there for 7 years.
I remembered that.
Yes,
that is really
very familiar.
Exciting. Yeah. So, but you can imagine just the first time you see Broadway, and
it's great to visit. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that was a favorite one. Last summer, my daughter and I went to Australia. So that was amazing. Yeah, and I think snorkeling in the Great Barrier Reef, and that was definitely a highlight.
My sister worked in Australia for a year, and she flew my other sister and I out there with her points to visit her.
Wow.
So we got to go to the Great Barrier Reef and snorkel, and that's when I saw my first shark, and only shark when snorkeling. It was amazing.
I did not see a shark. That's probably a good thing.
It was far enough away I wasn't nervous.
Yeah, it is. I think it's something you just can't explain to other people. I was like, I feel like I'm Jacques Cousteau.
Exactly. You mentioned a couple times throughout the podcast about your granddaughter, so I can tell you're a beaming new grandmother. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a grandmother?
Yes, so it's wonderful, and everybody will tell you this ahead of time. It's like all of the fun parts about being a parent without the icky part. So
right.
So it really has been delightful, and especially right now because she is 9.5 months old. So that's she's like right getting into this really cool part that corresponds to my research interest too. So it's fun to watch, although it's good for her and for most kids, but they just go through them so quickly. Like, oh man, you were just doing this last week, and now you're doing all these other new things. So
you'll just have to request another grandchild. That's all.
That's a bone of contention. So Grandma stays out of that one.
It's probably smart.
Yeah, but she is a delight, and it's wonderful that they live in Lawrence, and we get to see them often. So our family is we really enjoy each other. So I just kind of like knock on whatever all the time.
You're very lucky for that. Yes, absolutely.
I think it is one of the best things of life.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful asking you questions about severe disabilities. Something I'm not real familiar with, so I learned a lot today, and I really appreciate you coming in to do this.
Oh, it was a joy. I really enjoyed our time together, Angela.
Thank you. To our listeners, that was Dr. Nancy Brady, faculty member in the Intercampus Program in Communicative Disorders at the University of Kansas. Thank you for listening, and rock chalk.